Our second scripture lesson this morning comes from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5, verses 1 through 12, known as the Beatitudes. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. What does home mean to you? Is it a geographical place, the physical structure you live in, or is home a feeling? A writer, a sociologist, and a philosopher spent an evening together discussing the concept of home. Among the three of them, they had lived in more than half a dozen countries and each fluently spoke at least 2 languages. They quickly decided that country of birth, mother tongue, or length of stay does not make a place home. The consensus they reached was that home is the place where you feel a sense of safety, familiarity, stability, and belonging. This concept of home is precisely the concept that is violated when we find ourselves in a season of spiritual disorientation. As I mentioned last week, theologian Walter Brueggemann divides the Psalms into those of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. Last week, in the Psalms of orientation, we found expressions of confidence and certainty about who God is and who we are. This week, with Psalm 88, we encounter disorientation. This psalm and the others in this category pull back the curtain on a part of every life of faith, those times when we lose our confidence in who God is and who we are, when we no longer feel at home in the world. My friend Samantha is a pastor at a church in North Carolina. She recently went to New Orleans with some friends and marveled at the way this city brings together a wild mix of cultures: French, Cajun, African, Spanish, English, welcoming all kinds of people as they are. But it was clear that there are still painful wounds and fault lines of division. One day, Samantha and her friends embarked on a self-guided walking tour of some of the city's historic houses. They came upon a beautiful yellow mansion which had a sign in front identifying it as an inn. They began talking to the manager of the inn, and Samantha asked him who used to own this house. "Well, it was owned by a Presbyterian minister," the man replied. Samantha's face lit up. "Well," she said, "actually, I'm a Presbyterian minister." "Is that right?" the man said. "Well, this guy's name was the Reverend Benjamin Palmer. He was a big racist. In fact, they say his big Thanksgiving sermon was about how the gospel condones slavery, and it inspired the state of Louisiana to break away from the Union." "Huh," Samantha said. "Did I say I was a Presbyterian minister?" She wanted in that moment to become invisible. The man's words threw her into a state of disorientation, for it made no sense to her that a fellow minister, a follower of Jesus Christ, could perpetuate injustice and suffering rather than work to eliminate it. These kinds of disorientations happen to all of us, and the sense of confusion and shame, and sometimes even despair that accompanies them can be short-lived. But they reveal to us this larger cycle of faith, from orientation to disorientation to reorientation and back again. The experience of moving among these states is what keeps our faith from stagnating. It keeps us moving forward and ever deeper in our understanding of what it means to live in God's world and be God's children. Of course, there are countless examples of disorientation that are neither short-lived nor easily transformed into a new and deeper understanding. Psalm 88 shows us a child of God who is profoundly disoriented, emotionally and spiritually, almost to the point of death. In the Jewish tradition, death was typically understood as a final separation between a human being and God. Death is the place where God is not. The psalmist writes, "I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave, like those whom you remember no more." This is a person whose world has been completely upended. We don't know why this is, but we can speculate. A terrible and tragic loss, a debilitating illness, a betrayal that has left him without any sense of safety, familiarity, stability, or belonging. As you can probably imagine, like Samantha, having people find out that I'm a minister has led to many interesting conversations over the years. Sometimes it just cuts the conversation short as a person tries to reconcile their image of a Christian minister with the person before them. Other conversations take a deep dive into thorny questions of sin and forgiveness. Sometimes it turns out the person has a secret they've been waiting to confess, and having a minister to talk to who's also a stranger seems like the perfect opportunity. But recently, the discovery of my professional identity elicited a response I'd never gotten before. After this person found out what I do, he fixed me with a defiant gaze and said, "Well, then maybe you can explain to me why God has abandoned me, why God obviously doesn't care a thing about me, why God doesn't give me the attention you might give the backside of a rat. Can you explain that?" I just looked at him, shocked at his vulnerability, and I'm ashamed to admit that in that moment, I found no words. Maybe if I'd had more time, maybe if he wasn't a total stranger, maybe there was a set of circumstances in which my theological training and experience would have enabled me to craft a helpful response. But in that brief exchange, I had nothing to offer this broken and hurting human being that would change his profound sense of disorientation. Now that I've had time to reflect on this encounter, I wish I had simply offered him a blessing, the kind of blessing Jesus announces to his disciples in the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes are the very first lesson Jesus teaches. As one preacher puts it, it is Jesus' inaugural address. As such, the Beatitudes lay a foundation meant to prepare the disciples for what's to come, for all they will be called to endure in his name. And what Jesus says here is that God's blessing is with those who are suffering. That statement right there, that God's blessing is with those who are suffering, should throw each of us into a state of disorientation. Because in our world, this is not how we understand blessing. Think about how we use the word blessed. We say we're blessed with a happy marriage, healthy children, meaningful relationships, or we're blessed with material resources that allow us to have a house or a car or travel. We say we're blessed when we get into the school of our choice or experience success in our careers. We say we're blessed to live in a country where we are free. But when Jesus teaches his disciples for the very first time, he starts by destroying the illusion that our health or wealth or happiness is a sign of God's blessing. Blessed are the poor in spirit, are those who mourn, are the meek. Blessed are those seeking what is right. Blessed are those working for peace in a world that glorifies war. Blessed are the persecuted, those being insulted and falsely accused. In his first teaching, Jesus disorients his followers with the good news that God is with us in our suffering. God's blessing is poured out upon us in our suffering. It is okay to acknowledge our disorientation, to cry out to God and to others as the psalmist does, because in it, God is there blessing us. I want to be clear, though, that I am not suggesting that pain and suffering are in and of themselves redemptive or valuable. But if, as Jesus promises, God is with us even in our most difficult moments, even when we feel abandoned by God and everyone else, then Jesus is also promising that our suffering does not go unnoticed by God. To the contrary, God is at work in it, because God is always working in and through us. Theologian Richard Rohr puts it this way: our pain always has something to teach us. But to find out what, we must first acknowledge it. A preschool teacher tells of her experience in a school that had 2 classrooms filled with students of the same ages and backgrounds. Each day with their lunches, the kids got a cookie tightly wrapped in cellophane, the kind of cellophane that sticks to itself and is really tight. In one classroom, the teacher would come around and just cut the cellophane off the cookies with a pair of scissors. In the other classroom, the teacher advised her aides, do not touch those wrappers, do not help the children open them. So those kids had to open their cookies themselves. Sometimes, as they tried to get that tightly wrapped plastic off their cookie, there was a mighty struggle, and the cookies were reduced to crumbs in the process. But each kid would eventually get the wrapper off. They were motivated, working through desire, frustration, anger, and accomplishment. They learned something about what they were capable of, and they were energized by all those around them going through the same struggle. Now, which of those 2 classrooms would you want yourself or your children to be in? I know that many of us are overwhelmed and in some cases deeply disoriented by all the changes around us in the government, in the culture, even in the church. Some of you feel personally threatened and afraid. Some of you wonder whether you can find that feeling of home, of safety, stability, and belonging. What our life of faith teaches us is that these times of disorientation are not punishment or signs of God's cruelty, as Jesus teaches us, not just with his words, but with his own life and death. It's that the ones who are poor, the ones in mourning, the ones seeking to do what is right, who are indeed blessed by God. For disorientation is a necessary phase of transformation, and transformation is God's greatest gift. A colleague of mine credits his grandfather, Ben, with being the biggest influence on his faith. Ben was a child of the Great Depression and a veteran of World War II. He returned from the war and got married, had 3 daughters. He started his own business, worked hard, and built a good life for his family. Then tragedy struck when his oldest daughter, Nancy, a teenager at the time, was in a car accident. The other 3 passengers walked away from the crash, but the car rolled over Nancy, and after several days in critical care, Ben and his wife made the agonizing decision to end her life support. When my colleague decided to go into ministry, he asked his grandfather about that time. After a long silence, Ben said that losing his daughter made him question everything. Though he'd always gone to church, he lost interest. He realized he'd only been going out of a sense of obligation, not faith. He then spent years questioning God, blaming God for his daughter's death. He was confused and hurt and angry and disoriented. Then one day, he suddenly realized that the anger and hurt had come because he thought he understood how life worked. He thought if he lived a good life and worked hard, he could expect good things to happen. He realized he'd been trying to cut a deal with God instead of trusting God. With this realization came a choice. He could ignore God's presence and let his anger and hurt control him, or he could trust that God was with him and had been with him all along. He could choose to trust that even in his profound disorientation, he was truly blessed. Amen.